Working.
Do this. We'll share. Where did it go? Not there, is it? Okay, let me flip back here. Thought it was on here. It is. It's right there. Okay, so let me. Okay, share screen. Still not there. Oh no, oh, here it is. Okay. Optimize. There we go. Share. Okay. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
First thing.
Full screen.
And now you see once again Matthew and Luke with Jesus sort of trying to come through, if you will, from the background behind them. And again, you notice it's in Catalan because that'll move us to the next one.
These are images from Catalan, Spain.
We're looking, of course, as you recognize, at the nativity frontal, it's called, let us say, of Gaudi's masterpiece, La Sagrada Familia, in Catalan, Barcelona, Spain. Most of the time, I'm going to be showing you our own images that Sarah and I took there. Sometimes there's some things we can never get, and this is one of them, to get distance enough from it. In one sense, I'm using this, and it's a celebration. This is part of the celebration before we even get to questioning. But it's a powerful part of the celebration. You know, if you have a crib beneath the tree, and maybe the tree in your home maybe not so much a agricultural tree as something that comes through the mechanization. What does the tree have to do? Is it just decoration? And why is Gaudi's nativity embedded in livestock stuff, not just trees and flowers and the rosaries, of course, but animals? It's almost like this is part of, he would say nature. I would not say nature, I would say evolution. So one of the huge questions beneath all the other questions we're going to be asking in the next 4 weeks, in fact, the question is, what does religion have to do with evolution, with cosmic evolution? Or put another way, what does, guided by Gaudi maybe, what does Christianity's advent have to do with humanity's evolution?
Christianity.
That's really the question behind the question, beneath the question, above the question, below the question. So go to the next one. If you're inside the cathedral, the first time I was there was in 1960, there was no roof there. Looking up at the way he has forced you to look up. I have read the mathematics of this and the geometry of this, and to be quite frank with you, I don't fully understand it, but it does remind us that evolution seems to think in mathematics and geometry. Because hold on to that image and then go to the next one.
He's going to mention this idea of parabolic.
You find exactly the same thing if you imagine yourself, courtesy, I think, of Alamy in this case, lying on the floor of the forest and looking up. So in every way, what Gaudi wants you to imagine is inside what he would say nature, which I translate as evolution, because nature is not just lovely sunsets and, you know, nice views and all the rest of it. Nature is also evolution. So you're forced by La Sagrada Familia to put religion back within evolution. I'm putting it that way, within evolution. Maybe religions are simply intimations of evolution. So hold on to those first two images. And now go to the next one, which focuses more closely on what you heard. I could only see this, to be honest with you, after I got back home and Sarah had taken a huge number of close-ups or distance pictures, and we blew them up onto kind of connected with our television. Everywhere you look, the nativity, we're just focusing on the nativity frontal, the story of Matthew, the story of Luke, the nativities are filled with images of ordinary life. I mean, it's embedded in a forest. And you don't think, well, this is really cute. Isn't this nice? He's kind of got a nice background. This is Matrix. Jesus, his nativity is all involved with domestic animals. Look at them. They're the barnyard, as it were. And then down at the bottom right, you can see, it's very hard to see, on the right, there's a woman. I don't know if you can see my cursor. She's carrying a basket of bread there. And there's another woman here who's with a wine. Maybe it's home-brewed wine. Let's see. So
you saw
women, after all, no matter what you say about male priests or anything else, women, the bread and the wine, and then of course the phoenix. So everywhere we are on this
side of it is the birth
La
narrative.
Sagrada Familia, you're coached, you're forced, you're seduced to put this back into the matrix of evolution. So if we can go to the next one. All right, we're now ready for the second part, to start questioning these differences. And throughout this, I will use this as my logo. So you're constantly remembered of these medallions inside the church. There's all four. There's four evangelists, of course, there. Matthew in Catalan and Luke in Catalan. All right. So the next one then. This is keeping Trip very busy. All right, a close-up of the nativity facade. And you might notice it's kind of shaped like a tree. I have no idea if that's accidental or simply part of the architecture. This is the one part of La Sagrada Familia that Gaudi actually did the way he wanted it and saw it done the way he required. And on this, facing your screen, you may be able to see down here, if you can see where my cursor is moving. Usually I make the cursor much bigger, but I forgot to do it, sorry. This is the Matthean side, the left side, and then the Lucan side is the right side. You can see the shepherds are coming there. This is the Nativity, this is the Annunciation, and the Magi are coming from Matthew. So this is Matthew's side here, and Luke's side
Shepherds
here.
Kings.
And they're all there, and this will be my background. Over here on the wider one that Trip just showed you there, for example, there's more Matthean ones, but we'll get to them. Okay, the next one. To begin the differences, the first, I'm going to be looking at three sets of differences. As I said, genealogy, Annunciation, birth. And I'm emphasizing the differences to set up. And I'm now repeating what I said before. My intention in all of this is to understand authorial intention. What's Matthew up to? What's Luke up to? And it's kind of common courtesy, if you're listening to somebody or reading somebody, kind of shut up for a moment to make certain you know what they're saying. Then you can say, I disagree, I dislike. Then you make your judgment. That's fine. That's fine. But first of all, you have to say what they're up to. And it's important in this case because these writers thought they were writing not just for then. For a moment in the first century, they claimed to be writing for now. Wow, that's a big claim. They thought they were writing for now, for an ongoing now. So it's fair enough to ask of them, what did they mean then? And also ask, what does it mean now? And if it doesn't mean anything for now, then they blew it because they were writing for now. So we're going to look at the differences in the genealogies of Matthew and of Luke. And we can start with the next one then. This is sort of ironic. You know, 3 times in my life, I walked through that door into La Sagrada Familia, and I never realized until I was doing close-ups for this, that that's the genealogy. As you spiral up that doorpost, I don't know what you call it, the doorpost, up towards the Nativity, which is right here. As you do that,
Can't see us.
you're reading the genealogy of Matthew. Yeah, you can see probably on the left there of it, the Magi are coming in towards the Nativity, And then on the other side, the shepherds are coming. But I never realized, I walked right past it. All I noticed was that, excuse me, extremely crude piece of wiring around it so you don't rub it. So all it does is you kind of don't go near it because it's spiky and wires. But that's actually the Matthean genealogy spiraling upwards, or the Lucan genealogy. I tried to read it, but the high resolution is not high enough to read which it is. So we're going to look at the genealogies as the first. And if you move to the next one, 5 differences. And in one sense, I think almost this first difference is a clue to the whole thing. And the differences between the genealogies should be enough to tell you what's really going on in all of this. Because the people who put together the New Testament weren't idiots. They could read the genealogies. They knew they were completely different, that you had over 40 and people in stems in Matthew, but you had twice as many in Luke. And wait a minute now, what's going on? So first of all, location. In Matthew, the genealogy is given right off. It opens Matthew, as you know, before Jesus even gets born. You're told who he is. Now look over in Luke. Strictly speaking, it's not even in Luke 1 and 2. It's not in the infancy story. It's when Jesus begins his public life after John the Baptist. Now that's the powerful indication of what they're up to. Matthew is going to tell this was preordained for all, as it were, because it starts before even Jesus got here. He was slotted into an ongoing program, as it were. And as you know, there's 14 from Abraham to David, then 14 generations from David to the Babylonian exile, and 14 to Jesus. Oh, it had to be 14, 14, 14. So of course, it was all predestined. That's Matthew's point. And I don't think he'd give a hoots when he gets the names right in between, except maybe for Abraham, of course, and David and Jesus. Luke, on the other hand, is thinking like a good Roman. When a person hits the public stage in life at whatever age, Augustus did it at, say, what, 17 or 18? That's the time you give the genealogy. And of course, the genealogy can be quite different. So location, location, location. Second one, direction. As you know, the genealogy in Matthew descends. You start with Abraham and come down to Jesus. And that goes, of course, with the location. You're coming down to Jesus. All of human history is like waiting with bated breath for the arrival of Jesus. Look at Luke. The genealogy ascends from Jesus to Adam, but Jesus as Son of God, and Adam is Son of God. And that comes up, for example, if you look at the third. The generations. And by the way, there's people who can spend hours comparing all the names in this. I can't even do that, because I don't think either Matthew or Luke, as I said, with the exception of maybe Abraham and David, cared about the details in between. These are huge advertisements for Jesus. Matthew, genealogy has 42 generations between Abraham and Jesus. Now, even comparing the same period in Luke, he has 57 generations between Abraham and Jesus. Do I think it would bother them if somebody drew their attention to that? I think they would have said, get a life, get over it. So the next one. For example, this is pointed out again and again, and it proves that it's not very important. The grandfather of Jesus, the father of Joseph, is it Jacob or is it Heli? Or do we conflate them and say he had 2 names? Once again, I think the best advice from Matthew and Luke would be, get over it. And the final one then, the intention. This is what's really important, I think. The genealogy of Jesus in Matthew is the genealogy of the Messiah. It's called that. It's the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah. And that's done by showing you that it's all planned. It was foreordained. That's why the 14 works. You're expecting Jesus, as it were. If you are watching genealogy, you know he's due any day. Over in Luke, the genealogy of Jesus as the Son of God. He's called my Son, the Beloved, by God, just before the genealogy starts. Remember, that's the baptism. So the purpose of the genealogy is to proclaim Jesus as the Messiah or the Son of God. I shouldn't say or and the Son of God, because certainly Matthew thinks both and Luke thinks both, but to emphasize different things: the Messiah, the Son of God. That's their intention. And I think into that, they'll take any list of people they can find anywhere and make it up. Let me move to the next one then. This is our next differences. It's a set of 3 differences between the 2 annunciations. And again, I remind you that the function of all of this is to try and figure out what they're up to. The annunciation you have to Mary in Luke, and the annunciation to Matthew in Matthew, of course. Wait a minute, that's a goof. I'm sorry. That should be annunciation to Joseph. That's a monument to how many times you go over this and over it, and you still can't see a mistake staring you in the face. Okay, annunciation to Joseph in Matthew, sorry. Okay, next one. This is an image just to remind us that this is a rather strange thing. This Raymond Telasco, the late Raymond Telasco, was a Chicago artist, and he had a magnificent image painting. It's called on the back, we have it in our house, The Angel of Annunciation. What I want you to think is, when you think of the Annunciation, don't you think automatically, almost inevitably, it's to Mary? I'm deliberately emphasizing him because he simply says the angel of Annunciation. He doesn't say to whom. And there's no Mary, or there's Joseph in this image. And it's a little unusual because Gabriel seems to be delivering the Holy Spirit a little bit like, FedEx or UPS at the moment. So if you look at the next one then, this is the Annunciation, a lovely one of the Annunciation at the top of La Sagrada Familia, the Nativity portal. And by the way, notice all around it, there's, foliage and everything else, but intertwined in there is the rosary. You see it?
By the way, let's grab
it's almost necessary to get high definition images of La Sagrada Familia and use them for meditation almost. All right, next one, please. Okay, back to my point. If somebody said the Annunciation, most of these images are simply called the Annunciation. Nobody says the Annunciation to Mary, but actually, strictly speaking, you're either talking with Luke of the Annunciation to Mary or with Matthew of the Annunciation to Joseph. And again, there'll be reasons. Why do we think it went that way? Okay, looking now to the next one.
It's the one we used in class.
I want to emphasize this as well, that there is an annunciation to Joseph. And part of the problem is that Joseph gets 4 annunciations. There's 5 annunciations. We'll see that in the next lecture, why. 5 annunciations in Matthew 1 and 2. The Magi get 1. Joseph gets 4. So it's kind of
funny he would call Annunciation
to regulate the whole procedure. What fascinates me about this church is it's one of the few places that I've been able to find where there's an annunciation to Joseph, which is certainly the annunciation to Joseph about Mary's pregnancy, not an annunciation to go to Egypt or come back from Egypt or go to Nazareth. And you can only tell that if it's in a line, if it's in a series, a progressive series of scenes. So that's why I'm looking at this church from Lombardy in Italy with gratitude for the person whom I'm crediting with it from the web, of course. Let's look at the pictures. If you could turn to them, please. You know, after a long time, they've been abraded badly, but you can make out, for example, a sequence of pictures. Again, the importance is if an annunciation to Joseph is not in a sequence of pictures, you have no idea which of the four it is. In this scene, to the left of your screen, you can see the angel speaking to Mary with her maid, Mary's maid, looking on from the background to see what's going on. So the angel speaks to Mary. Then you can make out enough to the right hand of your screen of the second scene, the visitation. So we're in a series. And then as you move on to the next image in the flow of images within, you see the dream of Joseph. You can make out enough, I think, that the angel is speaking to him and Joseph is asleep. And the reason we're certain that that is his first annunciation is that if you move to the next one, you can see Mary is pregnant. Mary is going with Joseph behind her on her donkey, on her mule or whatever, to Bethlehem for Jesus to be born. So we're following Luke's story. It's not the flight into Egypt. The only way you can know that is Mary doesn't have Jesus on her lap. She's going to Bethlehem. So this is definitely the annunciation to Joseph. And as you move to the next one, it raises this huge issue. Now, I'm not asking a historical question about Jesus. I'm asking a literary question about Matthew. Why does Matthew raise this whole issue that Joseph sees Mary pregnant and suspects adultery since he knows he's not the father, and goes through the whole thing, and then the angel has to tell him, you know, go ahead, marry. This is Mary is conceived of the Holy Spirit. Wouldn't it have saved a lot of trouble to have told Joseph a few verses earlier?
Joseph, you are not the father.
Oh, why wouldn't you presume that Mary, having received the news from the angel, greets Joseph when he comes home, I suppose, from work and says, good news and bad news. I am pregnant and you're not the father. Why does Matthew, and in a way, this is the key to Matthew, the key to the whole understanding of Matthew. Why does he set up this whole problem? And in this image, it's a rather unique image in this church, you see the implications of the project, of the problem of not having the angel announce to Joseph that Mary is going to be pregnant, if he wants to have it announced to Joseph at all and not to Mary. Tell him a few verses early,
Flexible books,
so he won't suspect this. And
things he's written. He's probably
in Numbers, you're
I found
told of
3 that I have on my shelf.
something called
The one I
what's
showed y'all
a
earlier.
trial by poison, I'm going to call it. A trial by poison, almost.
Jesus
Where
and
if a woman is accused of adultery, she has to swear that she's innocent, and the words written out are put into a flask of water, and she drinks the water to prove her innocence. It's a rather ghastly scene, and I don't know it from anywhere else. I'm not saying it's nowhere else. I've never seen it anywhere else. And it underlines for me, why does Matthew creates this whole problem of the pseudo-adultery of Mary, which then goes off into all sorts of diatribes against Christianity, that Mary is really, Jesus is born of adultery and all the rest of it.
we're interrupting.
There's no problem with Luke. Luke takes it for granted. Presumably,
to be the old
Mary is told by the angel that she's pregnant. Presumably, she tells Joseph and off to go, the two of them, to Bethlehem. And there's no question of adultery. So really hold on to that. It's maybe the key difference. Going to the next one then. In Sagrada Familia, one of the scenes there shows, for example, the happy marriage of Mary and Joseph. Yeah, fine. A happy marriage, but at the risk of accusing Mary of adultery and therefore having her possibly, we do not know what would have happened, because obviously if a couple are in good Jewish law, if a couple are engaged and the husband-to-be makes an accusation, shall we put it delicately, the burden of proof is on him, not on her. But in any case, you have the happy marriage and the trumpets. If you go to the next one, you can see the trumpets of the Sagrada Familia celebrating the happy marriage. But I want you to remember the problem as we go on. Okay, moving to the next one, please, Trop. All right, going back then to the differences. The first one is about choice. The Annunciation is to Mary about her own pregnancy, as we saw. Holy Spirit will come upon you. Matthew, Annunciation to Joseph about Mary's pregnancy. The child is of the Holy Spirit. Fine. They're both reassured of the Holy Spirit, but Mary ahead of it. And by the way, Mary gets to say, okay. All those stories about gods coming down to women and impregnating them in Greek and Roman mythology, usually permission isn't asked. At least the Holy Spirit asked, and Mary gets to say, okay. So the choice is the first difference. The second one, the time. Again, the Annunciation is to Mary at her own pregnancy, or the Annunciation is that it's going to be, if she says okay, and she does, you will conceive and bear a son, says Luke. Over in Matthew, the Annunciation is to Joseph, as we've said, after Mary's pregnancy. That creates the whole problem that we've gone into. The child conceived in her. So they're both talking about the time of conception. And then we can go to the third one. The next slide is the result, and we know that. The Annunciation of Mary presumes, if you're reading Luke, I don't know anyone who said, "Ooh, how did Joseph find out?" Common sense says, of course, next time Mary met Joseph, she tells him about Gabriel and the visit and the miraculous conception, and that's what you presume, and there's no problem, and off they go to Bethlehem. Now, Matthew, as we saw, there's no report, and then you have the suspicion of adultery, the option of divorce, and all the horror stories that result from that. So again, the question, what is Matthew up to? And then moving to the next. So the next set of differences, set of two differences on the birth of Jesus. This has to do with the witnesses and the context of the birth of Jesus. In Matthew, it's the Magi story and Herod's earthly slaughter. And the Magi, of course, get into the crib, but Herod's earthly slaughter tends to get quietly shelved in the Christmas story. In preference, of course, to Luke, where the shepherd story and God's heavenly peace. So instead of the Magi story, you get the shepherd story. And instead of Herod's earthly slaughter, you get God's heavenly peace. But unfortunately, it may be the Herods of the world in Matthew that stop what happens in Luke. So let's look at the differences then. And you know them, of course. And again, going back to La Sagrada Familia, the Magi, usually shown as three because there are three gifts. We have no idea how many they were, but they are Magi, so they're scholars, Persian priests. Always a little amusing to think of three Iranians in the crib. So you might want to think about that when you're looking at your crib. So the Magi in Matthew, and then if you look at the next one, results in the slaughter at Bethlehem. And again, you wonder, or you should be wondering, are your firstborn child who reaches the age of reason should say, "Mommy or Daddy, if this magic star was guiding them all the way to where Jesus was born at Bethlehem, why did they stop off for directions in Jerusalem?" This is the danger of the age of reason. You start to ask the obvious questions. And again, I'm asking a literary question of Matthew, not an historical question about Jesus. Why did that happen? Why didn't they just come up from the south and go straight to Bethlehem? Why? And besides, we know it's a caricature that males don't ask for directions. So would 3 male magi really ask for directions? Or is this the biblical injunction? Never ask for directions if you're lost? Anyway, hold it again for the next lecture on Matthew. And moving then to the other side, of course, Luke, the shepherds. So the contrast between the magi and slaughter, the shepherds and peace. And then going again to the next one. So the center of La Sagrada Familia is the whole heavenly choir. And I'm not sure what to do with some of those people who look like young angels, if angels have children, or whether they're just local people. But the surrounding there is the choir of angels, which are, of course, the ones who bring the news of heavenly peace down to earth. And they all have their instruments. And then in the middle, there's these other people, and I presume they're ordinary people, local people, but they're not in the story. But right down below this, of course, is the birth. So moving then to the next one. All right, part 3, trying to look at these differences now, trying to explain them. And when I say explaining them, I'm giving you a hypothesis, a proposal. This proposal has to be tested, in the next lectures. So it's an ongoing series. All right, moving to the next one.
He's getting the differences between the two narratives.
Here's the thesis or the proposal, suggestion, any term you want. Matthew 1-2 is here's the term, parabolic overture to the entire Gospel of Matthew. It's a parabolic overture. It's not the first chapter. It's a parabolic overture. And conversely, Luke 1-2 and the genealogy is a parabolic overture to the Gospel of Luke Acts.
That parabolic.
Now that has to be tested.
Is not a mathematical.
The top part, Matthew 1-2, will be tested in the second lecture, and Luke 1-2 in the third lecture. Let me explain what I mean by parabolic overture, moving to the next one, an overture. And by the way, I should tell you, I spent 5 years at a boarding school between 1945 and 1950. The headmaster, Father McClune, loved Gilbert and Sullivan. So every year the students put on a Gilbert and Sullivan play, and they did it for the school and for the townspeople. And so I knew stuff by heart from Gilbert and Sullivan. I am the captain of the Pinafore and the right good captain too. I'm very, very good and be it understood I command a right good crew, as long as I don't think I can do it. That's when I first came in with the word overture. Because in Gilbert and Sullivan, the melody that the orchestra plays at the beginning is not just interesting, music to get you going. It gives you the arias you're going to hear when you get into the rest of it. So you say, oh, that's the one that's about that. That's the one about this. That's the one. The overture is not the prelude. It's not the prefix. It's not the prologue. It's like a warning of coming attractions. It's like a teaser of what's going to happen in music. I took it from Wikipedia. The word comes from the French word for opening. It opens the show. Well, yeah, it does more than open the show. So there's a prologue. Overtures usually have tunes which are going to be heard during the opera or ballet. In this way, it prepares the audience for what is to come. Now, that's where I'm getting my word overture from Matthew 1-2, Luke 1-2. They prepare the audience for what is to come. In other words, if you get 1 and 2, you've got the whole story in nuce. Down from Britannica. A more modern form of the opera overture was established by Gluck. He declared that the overture should prepare the audience for the plot of the play. Musical comedies, operettas. prepare the audience for the plot of the play. Prepare the audience. Both of them say that. So let's see, that's the thesis. Now let me move to the next one. Look at this image. This is an historical overture, let's say. The state funeral of Edward VII in 1910. This was a scene taken, a film taken in Windsor Castle on Friday, May the 20th of 1910. Count it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of the crowned heads of Europe, including in the middle, of course, the king at that time, George, and behind him, the Kaiser. Should watch your back, George. Anyway,
The father of the
look at
David.
that scene, and then let me go to what I mean by a literary overture. Going to the next one. Because here's where I first saw it. In Barbara Tuchman's magnificent book, The Guns of August. It's the story of the first months of the First World War. So it's about 1914, August 1914. She starts it, if you look over to the table of contents, she starts it with the funeral. See it up there? She doesn't call it an overture. It is an overture. There's 3 parts to the book: the plans, the outbreak, the battle. But up front, she puts the story of the funeral of Edward VII. And she says, on that May morning in 1910, the greatest assemblage of royalty and rank ever gathered in one place, and of its kind, the last. It's a funeral for Europe, you might say. It's an overture. And that's where I first really saw it. That's why I want to give the credit. When I read that, and I thought, why did she start in 1910 and not in 1914, or at least the prelude, or way back? She wants you to read this as a mourning, as it were, not just for the royalty of Europe, but for all those who would die in the war to follow. So I call it an historical overture. Now, it did take place. It's not a parabolic overture. So let's move to a second type of overture. The next one, please. Think of this. This is a manuscript from the ending of Luke. You can make it out. And the beginning of John's Gospel. I want you to think of an ancient manuscript, kind of wall-to-wall writing, because papyrus is too valuable to waste. So it's all in capital letters. There's no breaks. There's no chapters. There's no, it ain't what you would call user-friendly. Now, if you happen to kind of know it by heart, as readers would, then you can get in arche logos and okay, you're rolling. But if you're reading your newspaper like that, you go crazy, even if you know the language quite well. So you'd be very, very happy if you're reading a manuscript like this, if somebody did the next slide. If somebody at the beginning of a manuscript of Matthew or Mark or Luke or John actually gave you an overture, a clue in, an opening section that doesn't just start the story, but gives you an overture to the whole. Almost saying in effect, okay, if you get this first chunk, people, you got the whole. And use it as a lens through which you can see the whole. So, taking Gaudi's 4 medallions inside the cathedral. Now, could you go back, please, Trip? Inside the cathedral for a moment. You have a parabolic overture from Matthew. That's going to be the argument of the next one, that this is a parable. In other words, if you're asking, did Matthew 1 and 2, apart from Jesus and Mary and Joseph and Herod, did that actually happen? No, the answer is it didn't. But neither did the Good Samaritan happen. So if you don't like parables, please take it up with Jesus. He started this bad habit. Parable is a made-up story, what we call a fiction. And at the end of it, Jesus can say, go and do likewise, which means you have to figure out what's the point of the parable and then do likewise. So a parable never happened. but it's telling you something terribly important.
I will say
So
that
Matthew 1 and 2 is a parabolic overture, for all of Matthew.
the kingdom of heaven is
Could be an historical overture, but it's not. And now if you look over at Luke, over to the third case, that's also a parabolic overture, but to Luke. So since Matthew and Luke have different visions of Jesus, it is no way possible they could have the same infancy story, because each of them is a made-up parable. But its function is to overture the gospel. Now, the alternative, you have 4 gospels, only 2 of them use parabolic overtures, all of them use overtures. Mark, for example, uses an historical overture. He uses John the Baptist. So when you get into Mark and you read what happens to John the Baptist, he comes out of the desert, he preaches, and he gets arrested. Oh boy, you know what this story is going to be about. Somebody called Jesus who will come out of the desert, preach, get arrested, and if you know what happened to John the Baptist, which you'll know at least by chapter 6, you know what's going to happen to Jesus. It's an historical overture. Now, John, of course, would find all of these totally inadequate. John says it's about the Logos. The Logos is a good Greek word, feebly translated as the word. The Logos is the intelligibility of the universe. It's the Greek conception that the universe, although a mysterious place, kind of makes sense. There are patterns in there that make sense. The stars do regular stuff and the seasons do regular stuff. So the Logos is the intelligibility of the universe. And the awesome claim of John is the intelligibility of the universe is incarnate in Jesus. And of course, the intelligibility of the universe, the Logos, is what we would call today, once again, evolution. That's what makes it intelligible, insofar as it is at all. All right, can we go to the next one? Let me just bring it back to America and Jefferson. Jefferson's Bible that you know about, you know the story. He took Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in 4 different versions in Latin, Greek, Latin, French, and English. That's across the 4 there. He was a president. And he carved them all up to get rid of the stuff he thought was kind of rubbish, in plain language. And of course, the stuff that was rubbish was in a way the most important pointers to the whole, because parables, like in the teaching of Jesus, are maybe the most important stuff in there. In any case, he begins with chapter 2. See up there at the top of the 4th column over, chapter 2. You can see it. He totally dismisses all this kind of rubbish up front. None of this overture stuff. If you look at the Jefferson Bible itself, this is a facsimile version. It's rather fascinating reading. If you go to the next slide, the image here from Peter Mansur, who put together this facsimile version, he says Jefferson had no use for the first chapters of any of the Gospels. And that was a terrible failure. He blew it in plain language. Not for him were the cast of thousands genealogy of Matthew, the prophet Isaiah's evocation of a voice crying out in the wilderness found in Mark, the epistolary prologue or the angelic backstory of Luke. Perhaps least of all, the cosmic poetry of Logos and light offered by John. And it's sad, because with all due respect, President Jefferson, if you can't handle parable, stay out of the Bible. If you can't handle metaphor, stay out of the Bible. By the way, stay out of Shakespeare as well. Because these are messages and the authors knew exactly what they were doing. So if you go to the next one. This is our last images then. And again, they are the solution to the differences, but it's a solution that has to be proved or disproved by studying, does it work? So I'm saying the infancy gospel according to Matthew 1 and 2 is a parabolic overture. Now, both those words are absolutely important for me. It could be an historical overture. Could be an historical overture. Maybe if you only had Matthew, we would think it was an historical overture. But we have Luke to compare it with, and then the other two, and Paul, of course, who has nothing about the equivalent story. And then the next one. So for the test of the third lecture, the infancy gospel according to Luke 1 and 2 is again a parabolic overture for the entire gospel according to Luke Acts. And since any reader who's read Luke Acts, by the way, notice it's not just Luke, it's Luke Acts. So that'll be question for the third lecture. If you compare Matthew and Luke, you know they're different visions of Jesus. Nothing wrong with that. But then, of course, if the overtures are what we think they are, they have to be different. And I think the final image, I think there is one more. Yes. All right. Go back to this, the final image. I think that's actually there's another one in there, but it's fine. I think the final image I wanted to put up there was the Matthew. That's fine. Don't bother, Trump. It's fine. Notice that's Moses, Jesus, and John the Baptist. So that'll do as an introduction to the next one, because when we're looking at Matthew, it's going to be especially Jesus and Moses. And then when we turn to Luke, it's going to be especially Jesus and John the Baptist. So it'll be a contrast in each case, but again, differing contrasts. So that sets us up for the next two lectures. And then the last one, as I said, will be looking at what do they both agree on, apart from Mary and other names like that. So I think we are ready.
Okay, so now he just gets into questions and things, and there were 5 major questions. What I've done is I've kind of printed them out. Well, not printed them. I'll send them to y'all with the link to the video. I put the timestamps on where that question starts to be answered, because they get really involved. I mean, if you saw, we were only halfway through the video, so so it does. The answers get kind of involved, but I hope that's all right. He used to be more dynamic. I think his age is catching up with him, but he does. But he's very intelligent. He is one that if you were to reach out to him by email or social media, he would answer as soon as he read it. He's just that kind of guy.
His life, yeah.
Right. So he's from Ireland, but he lives in Florida right now. So Fort Myers area. So yeah. But he gets around. He does talks all over the world. So anyway, he's a former Catholic priest who he butted heads with some of his ideas. He's a Jesuit by trade or by trade. They were the smart, they're the smart ones. So he butted heads, left being an ordained priest, got married, and so that's the story of his life. So anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and end it here. Good to see y'all, Harlan and Margie. I'm right here. And yeah. See, are y'all coming to church this morning or no?
Me.
You are? Okay. Well, we miss you, Margie.
Okay, I'm planning on being there next week. I think I can get it together by then.
Okay, I hope so, because you're preaching.
I'm a good person.
She does that every day.
Oh, bye. I'm gonna go ahead and end the video.